Welcome back to another lesson in the Sports Speed Insider. And today we are going to start following on from what we looked at last week, understanding intensity and adaptation, with the next kind of piece to the puzzle, discussing the principles of conjugate sequencing and how that works in relation to loading. A big problem and a big area that is not well talked about, because it's actually quite complicated in its simplicity, is how do we effectively progress the intensity of training through different loading parameters and also through different specialized means. The reason why I say that is there is a vast amount of training that just continues to exist within the general realms of training. And if you're here, you definitely know that that is not what is going to help your athletes. The more stuff that we can let go of within our training, the more progress that we can make, especially in the general means. So I'm going to bring in our conjugate sequencing methods here, and as you can see, it's pretty cool. It looks like a fun graph and a funky graph at that. But this is taken from the former Soviet Union, from Yuri Verkhoshansky, and with his work. And what was discussed and what was popularized, this was a progression of training that was developed to help with the intensification of jump training. Obviously, you know that he is the grandfather of the shock method, the grandfather of plyometrics. And what he found, and I think this evolution exists within speed training and just creating specificity within the intensity of load, is that the individuals struggled to create gradual steps in order to expose an athlete to higher intensity training, because the goal of preparation, if you are a senior athlete, is to strategically increase intensity of exposure. If you're a youth athlete, it's to delay the intensity effect, because a senior athlete is matured. A youth athlete is maturing. So we have to keep using the general means of training to ensure the development. But when someone is senior, it's about how do we accelerate them, and how and within phases upon phases do we rinse and repeat this process. So here we look at the application of conjugate sequencing when we apply it to sprinting. So what we have at the bottom here is our extensive methods of training. And what we find, if you're here, you should really know the difference between extensive and intensive training. But for the purpose of the recording today, the extensive means of training are would be categorized as slow, submaximal, highly repeatable, more aerobic in nature, prioritize motor learning over physical outcomes, and task execution. So versus the intensive is all the opposite of that. So what we would find as an example of this is a really easy way to do this. So an extensive variation of maximum velocity is obviously going to be an extensive tempo variation. So it's a sub-maximal running. An intensive variation of acceleration or maximum velocity is to intensify the means of work within the same bracket. There's nothing different. In jumping, it would be sub-maximal broad jumps versus maximal broad jumps. Then we start to introduce the overcoming nature. So if we were to apply this to acceleration and working within the sport speed system, our extensive means within our learn, load, execute, our extensive means it's going to be everything. Everything's going to be super extensive, because we've created a strategic shift towards more specific training means. So you name it. And next week, on the next week call, we're going to discuss theorized motor unit contribution to different training means. So you can start to piece together, well, what exercise is going to give me what, and how can we start playing with this? Because it's such a fun way. Because as soon as you start implementing this, you can start really churning out results, because you know this is where the law of accommodation becomes really important. Because if we look at these top 3 levels, you could do extensive for 3 weeks, intensive for 3 weeks, check adaptation of targeted metric after post dose, and then look to add some form of resisted heavy. And there's 9 weeks of training done for you, and adaptation in abundance. So when we're at the bottom here, you're looking at extensive wall drills for acceleration. It's easier to apply this to acceleration to start off with, and our short to long approach. So because we do know that heavy resisted accelerations do not correspond towards maximum velocity. They don't target maximum velocity in the same way, just purely based on the load, the way that the force is being created because of the load at which is being applied, unless you are using heavy micro loads, which is a whole different topic in itself. So yes, we're doing our extensive wall drills, but then we can do our banded variations, we can do our drop shock variations, we can do our overspeed variations. Sorry, we can then start to do intensive methods of those as well. So make them faster, make them harder, make the guys work further for that step 0, 1, 2, and 3 on our wall drills. And that's going to be a really good block of training in there straight away. And then this is where people struggle to make some adjustments, because say, for example, we've done 3 weeks of extensive, 3 weeks of intensive, then we're trying to add in resisted heavy. What we have to do is remove the extensive work, the prioritize, like we have to get rid of all that sort of stuff so we can create space for the upward effects of more intensity. Because the extensive work, as you can see in the level 1 here, the extensive work is prepping us for the intensive work, and the intensive work is then going to prep us for the resisted heavy work. All right. And then the reason why it goes resisted heavy to resisted light, if we're doing 30-meter accelerations, our resisted heavy would be like super heavy accelerations. And then the light would be 50% load of that. So it's going to be a lot lighter, so we can do it a lot faster. Because remember, the metric that we're chasing is speed, and the way that we create speed is the intensity of that metric. All right. I'll say that again. The metric that we are chasing is speed, and the way that we chase intensity of that is within that metric, speed. So the faster we create, so a slower, heavier acceleration is lesser intensive than a lighter, faster one. And that's what you've got to be working towards. So the great food for thought for this week's lesson, this week's coaching session. I want you to think about how you're going to structure your exercises for extensive, intensive. I would write down a piece of paper, these 3 that I'm going to do for these 3 weeks. Then this is how I'm going to intensify them. And then this is how I'm going to measure against them. For example, if you can do wall drills, step 0 in your learn, load, execute, so a static star to our first step explosiveness is a really good way to measure that against everything. Okay, so for now, let that marinate, and then come back next week where we are going to be chopping it up about the motor unit recruitment for different types of exercises, and they'll all start piecing it together. So I will see you next week.